Hello, everyone at the Way Church. Chris and Angie Carey here with you again tonight. We're so glad that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to spend time with us again. What we would like to talk with you about tonight is what it's like down at Pine Ridge, what it's like down at Pine Ridge Reservation to minister down there, to be down there, a little bit about what the people are like, and Angie's going to start talking about a little bit about the people.
Hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining us and taking time to be with us. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Pine Ridge Reservation. You can go Google Pine Ridge Reservation and you can look up all the statistics about it. And it is a dark place. It is a place of sorrow. It's a place of sadness and discouragement. It's not all like that. I think people might get the wrong idea sometimes that that's all that it is, and it's not all like that. But there's just the history for the Native American people in the United States, and we've all heard a lot about that in the last year in our country. And so I just want to talk about the Lakota people in particular. I feel like they're a lot different than maybe some other tribes in other parts of the country, just because of the things that have happened to them, the incidents at Wounded Knee, and just a lot of the issues that they've had with the government, and that just generational trauma, I guess I would call that. On the reservation, it's poor, it's poverty, it's I know a lot of people will say like a third world country, but in our experience, I would not compare it to that. I would compare it to more poorness, and because of that, there's addiction, there's alcohol abuse, there's sexual abuse, there's physical abuse. They're just really broken people, and they've been broken for generations, and kids grow up in broken homes with broken parents, and it just goes on and on and on. And so they're a wonderful people. They're loving people. They're family orientated. They stick up for their families, but they're lost and broken, and they take a long time to trust you. That's something that I would say about them. We had to work a long time to have people trust us enough to open up to us and to share stories with us. You'll see a video from one of our dear little Lakota ladies. Her name's Georgine. She suffers from cerebral palsy, and she would tell you if you asked her. So if any of you ever come out and you ask her about us, she watched us for a long time before she trusted us. And so she's just wonderful. She's spunky and fiery, and if she gets mad at you, she throws her crutches around once in a while. But another thing that I would say about Pine Ridge is that a lot of missionaries, or a lot of ministries that come here, don't stay. They maybe stay for 1.5 to 2 years, and then they leave. And so they're used to that. They don't trust us because we don't stay. You know, why bother to get to know people if you're not going to stay? This reservation is dark. There's a spiritual warfare, which Chris is going to talk about a little later. It's difficult. It's hard. You make relationships. I can't even tell you how much time and energy you pour. I've poured into so many young women where they've come to know the Lord, and we've begun Bible study, and for months we've been meeting, and then because a family member says something about that's the white man's God, and you're giving up your Lakota traditions, they leave. In like a second, they leave, and all that time is just gone. We know the Word of God doesn't return void, and so we just continue to pray for them. But there's a high rate of burnout among missionaries and among ministries that come down here, because it is a constant pouring out of yourself, and sometimes there's not a lot of give back from them, and that's just to be expected. What else? I would say that the kids are especially hard too. They keep themselves protected. It's because there's so much abuse and so much trauma that happens to them growing up, and so that's what I would say about them. And they need love. They need love. They need to see that you're going to stay around. You're going to be faithful. You're going to walk with them. And I think a lot of times they do things to kind of push you away to kind of see if you're going to stay or you're going to come or you're going to go or not. But still a beautiful people that God has created for himself. So I'm going to let Chris talk about a little bit more about their traditional ways and how we deal with that on the reservation.
Yeah, so Angie alluded to or spoke about the fact that there's great spiritual darkness at Pine Ridge, and I think one of the best ways to kind of illustrate that is one of our partners down here at Pine Ridge for a long time was Wade McCarg, and Wade spent 7 or 8 years in West Africa as a missionary there, and has said that after being at Pine Ridge, there's and even being over in Indonesia and being in India and other dark places, that the spiritual climate at Pine Ridge is unlike anything he'd ever seen. And we've heard that from other people as well. And so much of it has to do with what Angie was mentioning with the historical trauma that happened through the Wounded Knee Massacre in the late 1800s, and just all of the anger and bitterness and rage that is built up amongst the people. Add to that the fact that the view of Christianity that came to Pine Ridge, first through the Catholic Church, but through white settlers, was such a negative one, because what they sought to do was to take Native children out of their homes and put them in boarding schools and teach them basically not to be Native. And that just really traumatized a whole generation that are now older. Like even our friend Dale was one, and Norma Blacksmith, who you'll hear from during this week, was another one who spent time in the boarding schools, and it just was a game changer in their mind as far as how they felt about white people. So we have felt that. Add to that the fact that even though there are a lot of other false religions down at Pine Ridge that are trying to proselytize, there's cult groups down here, all different kinds of false doctrines and things being thrown around. Their own native spirituality and their own native religion is led by medicine men. And there are medicine men in each of the districts across. So it's not like there's just one place on the reservation where there's a medicine man and he's the medicine man for the whole reservation. They're in each of the districts. And so one of the things that was kind of eye-opening for us here just in the last year was to talk with one of the Lakota pastors, and he said, the crazy thing is that the medicine men are making disciples, and yet the church down here, the believers in Jesus, they're not able to make disciples, but the medicine men are making disciples. Some of there's a number of ceremonies that they participate in down here that are really deeply pagan in their roots. And the reason why I point that out is because there are some that believe that you can mix native traditional ways with Christianity. And we just have come to learn, and have even heard from our native friends who are Christians that you can't do that. And it's obvious why you can't do that. God doesn't share his glory with another, and we know that from his word. One of the ceremonies that they do is called the Inipi, which is the sweat lodge ceremony. And they'll tell you that it has to do with purification, and going into the sweat lodge and having a medicine man oversee that ceremony is all about purification. And what it's really about is necromancy and contacting the dead. Those things, obviously, which are highly offensive to God. I think we have the example of what happened with King Saul when he went to contact the medium, the witch of Endor, in the Old Testament, and we saw what an abomination that was to God. And the other ceremony that they do is called the Sundance. And the Sundance is a ceremony that is just another deeply pagan ceremony. To me, it's such an illustration of how Satan is such a copycat and a liar. Because what they'll do is they'll have a ring with a tree in the middle, and they'll tie up prayers and put them in the tree. But they have these leather straps hanging from the tree with hooks on the end of them. And the men will stand around in a circle, and they'll pierce themselves with these hooks. And they'll chant and call out to the spirits, and they'll be bleeding. And they believe that when the hooks pierce their skin and they bleed, that somehow atones for sin. And so it's a false atonement. It's another example of total paganism, and it's another reason why you can't mix native tradition, native spirituality with Christianity. Now that makes it difficult because what that says, as Angie said, she's discipled women who have come a long way towards embracing Christ, and then their family just pulls them back because they say, well, you're denying your Lakotaness by following this white man's religion. And so it creates this whole problem of separating their culture, which is great, which is rich, from their spirituality, which is deeply pagan, as are many tribal deities. And so, we've encountered all different kinds of spiritual warfare down there. And it isn't like, sometimes you hear stories about the reservation and it's almost like people are scared to come down here. And I don't think it's at that level. At least we haven't experienced that. There have been times, though, when we're out and about and moving around, the enemy knows that we're there, doesn't want us there, and has caused people to come across us. And I've been threatened physically on a number of occasions. I've been threatened to be ganged, which is the term they use for basically beating the snot out of someone. We've had those kinds of threats. We've had all kinds of things. One example was one night Angie and I we were with the Young Life kids, and we brought them back to our church. And that whole night was just a really weird night. It was just an unusual night from the get-go. Before we went and picked up the kids, we stopped at Subway in Pine Ridge just to get a sandwich and a drink. And when we came out, someone had just thrown something like a red slushy or a red drink all over the front of our car. It was just like, man, has never happened down here before. It was just strange. But then when we went and picked up the kids and brought them back to the church, for some reason that night, and the kids were always great with us, but that night there was just a lot of nonsense. The kids were just, I don't know what got into them that night, but they were just really hard to deal with that night. And normally they were always so good for us. So we ended up taking them back to, back to the dorms when we were finished, but we had to go back to the church in order to pick up some of our supplies and things, and then we were going to go home. So it's late at night, it's dark, and Angie and I come back up to the church property. And as we were getting out of the car to go in, we just kind of looked and we noticed very visibly there was a kind of a mist, like this weird mist that was moving towards the church in our direction. And it was just this really strange phenomenon. I'd never seen anything like that before. And so we got inside the church and we got our stuff. And when we came out and loaded up the van, we were getting out and we were walking around. And what I experienced was I heard in my ear very clearly like a screeching sound, almost like a prehistoric pterodactyl scream or something. It was so unnerving. It was just strange. And it was like I could hear it coming, but it was right there. And I got in the car and I looked at Angie and I said, "Did you hear that?" And she said, "Did you hear that?" And so she had actually experienced the same exact thing on her side of the car. And we just felt like that was an example of demonic. There was something demonic there that night that was trying to intimidate us. And, in all of the cases where we had situations where we had the potential to be harmed or there was a demonic encounter, which happened regularly. We even had weird dreams and it affected our family. God was faithful to always rescue. And so that's not something that ever caused us to not want to go down there again, which I'm sure was the enemy's plan. So that's just a little bit about what the spiritual climate is like down there. It's just deeply pagan, a lot of witchcraft, and it's just woven into their culture. So that's the challenge that we have in dealing with them.
I'm going to talk just a little bit. I hope we're not too far over our time here, but we're just going to talk a little bit about this book, and I forgot my phone. It's called
Church in Hard Places.
Church in Hard Places by Mez McConnell and another guy, which I can't remember his name, but if you Google Church in Hard Places, and it'll come up with Mez McConnell. It's a book and he's a pastor, as Chris said earlier. He's a pastor in Scotland. He was born there, he grew up there, and he's a pastor in the Schemes, which is just kind of like the ghetto of Scotland. And he talks in that book so much about mercy ministry and how mercy ministry is good, but it's also harmful. And it mirrors Pine Ridge to a T. It's like he wrote the book about Pine Ridge because there are so many mercy ministries coming there. There's mercy ministries that are there, and then every summer, hundreds of churches converge on Pine Ridge and come and do, they're doing their best. They're doing vacation Bible schools. They're bringing food. They're bringing clothes. They're bringing all kinds of stuff like that. And while it's good, it's also hurtful to the people. They need the gospel most of all. More than anything else, they need the gospel. And so I would just encourage you to read that book. We can talk, if you want to talk to us more about that, I'd get into it in more length. If anybody wants to talk about that, I'd be happy to do that. Chris is just going to talk a little bit about, wrap up the reservation.
Yeah, so basically what we're talking about tonight is just the brokenness and the spiritual climate down at Pine Ridge, how lost the people are, and how much they need to hear the true gospel. And I mean, every single time we open our mouths, they need to hear a gospel proclamation. When we were, part of church services down here, so many times I heard messages about Christian living, and I always felt like, why are we preaching about Christian living necessarily every Sunday to people who aren't, by and large, aren't Christians? They're not regenerate. They're just coming to church because that's what they're used to doing. It's almost like we're telling them that they should live up to a standard that they can't, because they don't have a changed heart. Yeah. And so that's what they need. They need a changed heart. And we know that only comes about by faith in Christ, which comes through the gospel. And so we want to just kind of say again that part of the reason why we feel like God is leading us to start a faithful church down here, so that we can be a faithful witness, so that we can make disciples and truly disciple people the correct way. It's really hard to do that when we only, in the past, a lot of the focus on missions to the Pine Ridge, and I'm not just talking about us, but I'm talking in general, has been just short-term mission trips where people come in. They might preach a gospel message, they say they make some converts, then they leave, and people never see them again. So no wonder why we don't have success. So we want to be that long-term faithful witness that's planted there, not focusing on mercy ministry. And that's not to say that we won't help meet physical needs where we can, because that's part of God's call for us as believers as well. But the main focus has to be about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's what we wanted to share with you tonight. So one thing I want to just close with is one of the first times that we came to Denver to meet with you guys at your church, at the Way Church. We were able to go to Mac and Julie's house after and just meet with a lot of people. And the crazy thing was, during the time of fellowship, one of your church members, Christine Brady, she shared or basically spoke a passage over us that we had been reading the week before we came. So there's no way, we hadn't talked to her, we hadn't even met her. So there was no way that she could have known that we were praying over this. And it really was what we felt like God was pointing us to for future ministry. And that's a passage out of Isaiah. I just want to read the two verses. It's out of Isaiah chapter 58, verses 10 to 12. And it says, "If you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom be as the noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in scorched places and make your bones strong. You shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters do not fail. And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in." That's just a beautiful passage. And as we were contemplating that passage and just feeling like maybe the theme that God was putting on our hearts was a restorer of broken places, a repairer of the breach, we felt like that had to do with unity, and that's where God was pointing us. And then when Christine spoke that over us at Mac and Julie's house, it was such a confirmation that that's where God was leading us. And so that's really what's behind our heart for continuing ministry at Pine Ridge, is to be a repairer of broken places, not just to come in for a year and a half, try out missions, and then leave and never see these people again. We want to be here long term. So thank you again for your time. We'll talk more with you guys tomorrow night. It's been a blessing.
Thank you.